None of us like to be told what to do, but if we're honest, we often let our emotions take control of us. And when emotions become our boss, we create all kinds of hurt in our relationships. We sabotage our own reputations and we end up with all kinds of regrets. Is there a way to avoid all of that pain? Yep, and we're talking about it on this episode of Journey at Home. Welcome or welcome back. Our mission is to create content that inspires you to follow Jesus and live a better life. So subscribe to this channel. Turn on notifications by clicking the bell icon to keep up with the latest content. My name is Jarrod, by the way, and today I'm continuing our series on emotions we're calling You're Not the Boss of Me. Emotions are helpful assistants, but they make terrible bosses. And today we're diving into how to tame the emotion of fear. Fear is a really helpful warning signal. Without fear, my teenage self would have done some really stupid stuff in the name of impressing my friends and the girls that were standing around. But fear also robs us of opportunities, keeps us from restoring relationships, changes the way we parent our kids, causes us to shut down in our marriage, and even keeps us up at night. This ability we have to ask the question, what if, can keep us from driving our car right up on someone's bumper going 80 miles an hour because they won't get in the right lane. I mean, what if they brake suddenly? What if I lose control with family in the car? That's helpful fear. But the same ability to ask what if can create an endless stream of thoughts about our boss at work that prevents us from presenting our new idea. And what if she hates it? And what if she calls me out in the meeting? And what if I can't explain it right? Or what if might stop us from committing to volunteering with a local organization or keep us from saying anything to encourage a stranger who's having a bad day? Fear can easily become the boss that prevents us from using our God-given gifts and talents and abilities to make this world a better place. It can prevent us from making a greater impact for the good. It can rob us of committing to things that are hard but ultimately good. And fear can keep us from doing what's right even when it's unpopular. Fear is a horrible boss, and when it's in control, we are paralyzed by an endless stream of what-ifs. That's why nobody wants to be bossed around by fear. And good news, Jesus doesn't want anyone to be bossed around by fear. He spent quite a bit of time teaching his disciples about how to respond to it. And the ways Jesus taught his disciples to handle their fear is very different than the way we often respond to our own fears. There's a story that's recorded by Matthew that illustrates what Jesus was trying to teach his disciples perfectly. Jesus has been healing people and gaining quite a crowd who have come to experience this miraculous power for themselves. And then he decides to get away from the crowds. So he and his 12 friends get in a boat and head out on the lake. And while they're out there, Jesus takes a nap, which is great. And Matthew says that a really bad storm hits and waves start to come in over the boat. And the storm gets so bad the disciples wake Jesus up. I mean, just a quick note. If Jesus was sleeping, okay, that's pretty crazy to be asleep in the middle of all that. And if water is coming over into the boat, I just want to ask one question, like, how is he not waking up? Because isn't this the craziest part of the story? When they wake Jesus up, his response is to look at them and ask them, like, seems to be a really silly question, like, well, why are you so afraid? Wind and waves, Jesus. We're afraid for our lives. Boats can sink. It's dangerous to be out here, and it would be impossible to swim to safety in these waves. So, Jesus, your question, it's not really the one we're expecting. Surely, Jesus knows why they're afraid. He's not a dummy. So why does he ask this simple question? Because of what he does next. He wants to highlight something for these guys that's going to be important to remember. Matthew says that after Jesus asks this question, he gets up and tells the wind and waves to calm down. And then everything goes calm. Think about how scary that must have been. I know the boat seems like it's about to get capsized by these waves, but to be sitting in a boat with someone who can tell the wind and waves to stop, like that's a whole different level of scary, isn't it? Like that's exactly how Matthew describes this reaction of all the disciples. They all stop and look at each other and ask, what kind of man is this? I mean, Mark wrote down a version of the same story as well. Mark heard the story straight from Peter, who was also in the boat with Matthew and Jesus and the other disciples. And in Mark's version, he describes the response of the disciples with this phrase, now they were more afraid than ever. Like, is Jesus trying to scare them? Like, why are you so afraid, guys? Let me show you something to be scared about. I don't think that's what he was doing, but Jesus was trying to teach them something about their fear. In this moment, when they see Jesus command the waves and winds, their confidence in Jesus' power overwhelmed their fear. It's like the things they were frightened of were no longer all that scary. Jesus' power put their fear in perspective. Yes, there were some scary things happening. Waves and winds are scary, but Jesus seems to be telling them that even when there are things to be afraid of, they don't have to be afraid. A few stories later in Matthew, Jesus and his disciples are again bombarded by a crowd. And Jesus has just shown the disciples that if they'll trust him, they can feed 5,000 people with just a few loaves of bread and a couple of fish. And Matthew says he makes the disciples get into the boat. No joke. That last boat ride was so memorable for them, I doubt they even wanted to go on another boat. But Jesus, knowing their fear, makes them do it anyway. But this time, he doesn't get in the boat. He sends them off and he goes for a walk. Hey, Jesus, remember that time that the storm came and you calmed it? We'd rather you be in the boat, right? And sure enough, the disciples are out there all alone this time, and a storm blows up, and they're rowing and rowing and rowing, and it says they were making very little progress across the lake because they were having to work against the waves and the wind. And that's when Jesus walks out on the water to the boat, and they all get freaked out, yelling, "It's a ghost! It's a ghost!" And what's Jesus' response? He says, "Take courage. It's me. Don't be afraid." Peter is trying to learn this lesson about fear. So he's like looking at Jesus, "Hey, can I come out there with you? Because I realize being with you is actually the safest place to be." And Peter gets out of the boat and he's good for a few steps, but he stops looking at Jesus and he looks at the waves and he starts sinking. And so Jesus reaches out to Peter and he helps him back in the boat. And again, the wind and the waves subside. These guys have witnessed Jesus' power over and over again, and they still struggle to trust him in the face of their greatest fears. This is one of the reasons why I trust these stories written by Matthew and Mark and Luke and John. They write these stories that make them look silly, untrusting, fearful, and weak. If they were making these stories up to inspire a new religion, wouldn't they try to make themselves look brave and strong and smart? I mean, if they were trying to gain followers for themselves, they'd been better off writing these stories to make themselves look like competent leaders. Instead, all four of the gospel writers write about how afraid they were when Jesus was arrested. And they scattered, and they hid, and they denied even knowing him, and they stayed in the background as Jesus was put on trial and sentenced to death. And when he died on the cross that day, they all just simply left. They gave up. They were done. It was a good ride, but hey, they were scared for their lives until, and this is what's so encouraging to us today, they didn't get it until they saw an empty tomb. And then they saw Jesus alive and realized just how powerful he really is. And from that moment on, these same people who hid away during Jesus' trial were suddenly standing in the temple courts telling everyone that they saw Jesus was alive. They were arrested, they were flogged, but they didn't stop spreading this story about him being alive. They were told by the religious leaders of the day to stop or they would be killed. And they were chased down and they were always on the run and people wanting them to stop telling what they'd seen and heard. And many years later, as Peter is writing a letter to encourage some other believers, he tells them this: "Cast all your fears on him because he cares for you." This is what Jesus invites all of us to do. Trade our fears for his love. I mean, what a trade, right? The worry that's keeping you up at night, the anxiety you've got about your kids, the fear that drives you to avoid serving others with a little bit of your time, the fretting you do at work that keeps you from doing your best work. You can trade all of that for the love Jesus has for you. So how do you trade your fear for God's love? Let me just suggest a few practical steps you can take this week to begin living with Jesus as your boss and not your fear. Write down your fears. As you look at the list of fears, identify whether the source of that fear is your desire for one of three things. Here we go: safety, security, or satisfaction. Many times at the core of our fear is a desire for one of those three things. Once you've categorized your fears, spend some time doing a little research on Bible verses that speak to how God provides safety, security, and satisfaction. And then those fears surface. you go to your list of truth from Scripture. Focus on what God provides, that His provision for your safety, security, and satisfaction is enough for you. While your fears are real, they don't have to control your next move, because you can learn to respond to God's truth, not your fears. Because He tells us our fears have no power over us when He's with us. Jesus realizes the fears are real. He's not saying there's nothing to be afraid of. He just wants us to have more confidence in Him than the fears we're facing. Jesus becomes our boss, not our fear. Our boss conquered death. He really is God of this entire universe, and He's worth our confidence and our gratitude and our worship. Jesus' invitation is to trade our fears for confidence in His power and His love for us, even when there's something to be afraid of, because He is with us and He cares for us.